Good afternoon and welcome to this CCAN seminar today. This is the third webinar by Justin Jagos. My name is Pete Barbara-Johnson. I'm a researcher here at CCAN. I'll be chairing today's session. Justin's going to be talking to us more about realist evaluation, talking about dosage, timelines, and other considerations when conducting realist evaluations. Just before I hand over to Justin, I just wanted to say a couple of words about CCAN for people who may not be familiar. So CCAN stands for the Center for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We're looking at pioneering, testing, and promoting innovative evaluation approaches and methods, particularly in nexus areas, nexus being the food, energy, water, and environment domains and their interaction. And really we take at our core complexity, science, and theory and use the tools that gives us to think how might that improve evaluation methods, tools, approaches, etc. You can read more about CCAN at our website, and obviously hopefully you're already on our mailing list. So the format of the webinar today will be about a 50-minute or so talk from Justin, and then we'll open up to questions, and we can use as much time as we need there, I think, after for questions. The way the questions are going to work, because there's so many of us on the line, we can't have just an open discussion with everyone talking across each other. So as chair, and also Justin will be able to see them as well, what we'd like you to do is write your questions in the question box. Hopefully you can see on the panel that GoToWebinar throws up at you when you've joined, there's a box there for asking questions. If you could, throughout the talk and then once we're into the question session, do please type questions into that box, and then we can put those to Justin, and me and him can have a little discussion as that develops, as those questions come in. So yeah, please do. That really helps get a bit of interaction into the webinar. So yeah, that leaves just the last thing to say, I think, is maybe we will be recording the webinar, and the slides and or the video will go up on the CCAN website afterwards in due course. So yeah, that's me done. I'll hand over to Justin now.
So thank you, Peter, and thanks to CCAN for this invitation for a third session on realist evaluation. So I'm looking forward to this session. As some people may know, I am the director for the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis, and an honorary research associate at the Institute for Psychology, Health and Society at the University of Liverpool. And I have a website which is on the screen there, and you're free to check that out for events and upcoming workshops. I'm running workshops ongoing in Liverpool, London, as well as internationally, and I also have an online mentoring service as well. So you get free to check that out. My email is also on the slide set on the last page if you need to contact me. So today I wanted to talk about basically two facets of realist program theorizing, namely dosage and timelines of impact, because it's been my observation that these are aspects of program theorizing that are often left out or considered, maybe a bit late in the game when people are doing their constructing their program theories. So I've talked about program theorizing in the first and second sessions, and we will touch upon it again here. But I do encourage you to listen to the other sessions, as I have been building the material on the previous sessions. So things will make sense if you go back and listen to the other sessions as well. But just to start off, I'd like to just introduce the key points of the session today, so that if you have to leave early, you can at least see the main points here. So the first point I want to make is that realist inquiry involves theorizing programs to explain how they work, for whom, under what kinds of circumstances. So this is sort of been the general slogan of the realist tradition. The realist evaluation tradition is about what works, for whom, under what circumstances, and also how, so how programs work. So that's really nothing new. That's what people have been saying about, what realist evaluation does. And also that realist program theories can serve to sketch a program's basic architecture. So in other words, to help envision the intrinsic logic of programmatic efforts as they play out in context. So I've really taken to this metaphor of program architecture, and I really like it because it helps us to envision this idea of structures that have been put in environments and have been designed in a particular way to achieve outcomes. And so I think that works really well, the idea of architecture, the program's architecture, but what that actually means and what the building blocks of that architecture is a good question and something that we can discuss. But also, similarly, timelines of impact need to be theorized to understand reasonable expectations of time delay amongst the introduction of resources, the triggering activation of response, and the manifestation of outcomes of interest. So I've separated out three elements there. So we know that from our previous discussion that the mechanism is about the resources offered through a program and how people respond to the program. But there is a question about time and time delay and what is reasonable for us to expect the activation of a response. And if there's a delay between the resource and the response, or if there's a delay between the response and the outcome of interest, which might be two separate things. So I'll be talking about that. An important aspect of understanding how programs work is determining whether or not there is a dose effect. So here's the question: how many times does a resource need to be inserted into context before response mechanisms are triggered, leading to outcomes? So it's very similar to timelines of impact, but it's getting more specific to say that in certain cases, it might be the repetition of the effort that is needed in advance of change, improvement and change and outcomes of interest to manifest. And there may be other facets of realist program architecture that, while not immediately apparent, play an important role in determining outcomes. So that's sort of putting it out to you. I'm putting out two concepts here, dosage and timelines of impact. And as you broaden your sort of awareness of possibility, other things might come into view. So, I mean, the process of realist program theorizing is about brainstorming and opening up this retroductive capacity. So I've talked about retroduction in previous sessions. Just opening up that capacity to really go deep and understand how programs are working. So I'm going to show some examples in this presentation that are hypothetical examples, but they have been inspired by conversations I've had recently around people's projects, people's specific projects. But I'm not going to refer to any specific project here. I've created some hypothetical examples for just exemplifying what it is I'm trying to convey. So we've seen this before. This is a diagram that comes from Pawson and Tilley's Realistic Evaluation textbook. And it basically sort of depicts what they call the context mechanism outcome configuration. And essentially what they say is that under the right circumstances, so under the right contexts, mechanisms get triggered. And once mechanisms get triggered, then outcomes are produced. And so we're not in a frame where we're just trying to understand cause and effect. We're trying to understand what is the generative force that underpins our efforts. And that's the mechanism. So the mechanism is that generative force. So you may have an intervention, but then you ask, well, what is it about the intervention that's creating the outcomes? It's not just does the intervention work, but what is it about the intervention that's working? And then you try to get to the underlying mechanisms of action. And so in this diagram, as I've showed in the past presentations, is that the pink oval is the context, so the context is the backdrop. The mechanisms, you can think of the mechanisms having to do with the programmatic efforts and then the reactions to those efforts, and the outcomes can be intermediate or final outcomes. But I'll be talking much more about this in the presentation. So this is a recap. So I've showed this model in the previous sessions as well, but just to sort of a warm up here, we're just warming ourselves up to this idea of the realist framing of evaluation design. So here we have context and mechanism leading to outcome. Now, Pawson and Tilley have put forward that equation, context plus mechanism equals outcome, so that all outcomes can be traced back to their context mechanism interaction. So you can look at the second webinar for more detail on what I said about this context mechanism interaction. But to get into a realist evaluation frame of thinking, it's really about getting into this thinking around the interaction between context and mechanism. And context, like I said, you can think of as the backdrop of a program. And specifically when you're doing CMO configurations, you're pulling in those aspects of the backdrop that have a causal impact. Because you could argue that not everything in the context is having a causal impact or is having a significant enough causal impact on the outcomes. So you want to pull in those aspects that are really making a difference from the background environment. And then you want to study the intervention in terms of the intervention resources that the intervention produces and the stakeholder reasoning. So it can be the end user, the participant, or frontline workers, or policy architects, or the managers of the program, or across an implementation chain. Their reasoning, how they've reasoned through the receiving resources through the program. And then that leads to outcomes. Now you see there's a line there as well, where context mechanism is below the line. And so that is another element to the realist thinking. And I've used this metaphor of the iceberg before. The metaphor is just a starting point to a conversation about realist philosophy. It's not trying to sum it all up in one soundbite. It's just to crack the ice, if I may make another metaphor, because realist philosophy is very deep, it's very dense, and it does take time to really process and understand. But just from a superficial understanding, we can think of the outcomes as the observable, measurable outcomes. So that would be sort of the what is above the surface of the iceberg, in the iceberg metaphor, and that mechanisms are hidden, or they're difficult to measure, and they can be understood as sort of what's below the surface. So that's similar to in the pink table above, where you have the line and you have mechanisms below the line. That's like saying that there are underlying or underpinning forces that are responsible for the outcomes that we see. And if you approach research in this way, you end up with the kind of research product that can help to explain how a program is working or why it's working, as opposed to just whether or not it is working. And that's sort of the essential difference. And that context is the backdrop. But what's interesting, about context is the question about, is it the backdrop of the, of this area here, where you have the earth, the wind, the sky, the elements that are interacting with the observable reality, or is the backdrop the entire aspect of reality, which includes the underpinning, the hidden, that which is not readily observable? So that's a question. I'm not necessarily just providing with a definitive answer. I'm just putting out a question back to you about what is context. So generally we think of context as the environment, but the environment as the observable environment, or does that also include the environment which is beyond observability? So that's moving into a bit of a philosophical frame. So we're not going there too deeply in this session because we've got another agenda here. But that's sort of in a nutshell, if you can start to think of the realist paradigm as understanding this mechanism operating at a different level of reality, and that there are layers of reality, which is also connected to the idea of ontological depth. You can read about these concepts in the realist literature, both in Ray Pawson's work, tangentially in Ray Pawson's work, but also in other realist literature that I have mentioned before. So that's sort of the basic kind of frame of the realist approach in a nutshell. And then when we look at Pawson and Tilley's specific approach to conducting a realist evaluation or a realist synthesis, but in this case, I'm really thinking about realist evaluation. You start with identifying programs to be evaluated, and you establish the evaluation and review questions. And then once you've established those questions, the evaluation questions or the review questions, the next step, the suggested step, is to establish or construct candidate program theories and possible middle range theories. And the word candidate here is used because it's to suggest that you construct theories before you test those theories. You construct those theories, and they are candidate theories because they haven't been tested yet. Once you go through a testing process, an empirical testing process in your realist evaluation, then those candidate theories they either get refined, or they get refuted, or they get confirmed, and then they become evidence-informed program theories, because now you have evidence that have been scrutinized against those theories. So initially they are candidate theories, and then they become something more. And then using the CMO configuration, you develop protocols for data collection, you collect data, analyze data using CMO configurations, and at the end, the idea is you produce evidence-informed program or middle range theories to answer the questions: what works for whom, under what circumstances, and how. So this is a slide I have presented before, but this is just a refresher. Now, the question about dosage and timelines of impact may enter at the stage of establishing, constructing your candidate program theories. And that's what I want to talk about. So because it's important to think about dosage and timeline at that stage. What I'm saying is that it's important to think about it then, because if you think about it then you can develop your data collection protocol to determine questions around dosage and timeline of impact, as opposed to waiting to the end of your study when you realize at the end that actually dosage plays a huge role, but you didn't customize your interview guides to really try to explore these issues in interviews. For if you're doing interviews, if you're doing focus groups, it might be very valuable to optimize the time during those interviews and dedicate some of that time to questions around dose and timeline. But before we go too far, let me try to explain more about what I mean. Okay, so now if we're talking about establishing or constructing your candidate program theories, there's a lot that's been being discussed about this and how you do this, whether you go to literature, whether you go to stakeholders, how do you validate your program theories. That's all sort of basic discussion for realist evaluation, and there are resources that you can use to access to get better understanding of that. But I do want to just run through some basic idea that will help us in the slides that I'm presenting subsequently. So one of the ways you can do realist program theorizing is to use if-then or if-then because statements. So I'm just going to give you an example here. So this is say hypothetical, although I have to say this is sort of been informed by some of the current discussions I've been having So it's not completely out of the blue, but I'm also not trying to link this specifically to a program. But let's say this is an example of a program theory component of a study. And you use if then, so the example is, if communities most vulnerable to climate-related shocks, so for example, floods and hurricanes, are given mobile phones with specialized weather applications and push communication climate-related advice, then those communities will more quickly respond to climate shocks, leading to reduced mortality, injury, and property loss damage. So you see that it's the if-then statement can be very useful. And if-then helps because it sort of forces us to sort of develop a program theory statement that pushes us into a bit of a realist way of thinking. And you can add the because as well. So I didn't add the because in this statement, but you could try either. You could try if-then, you could try if-then because, and develop a list of program theory statements that have to do with the thing that you're studying, and it can become very comprehensive. So you could have, this could be one of many, many program theory statements in your initial program theorizing. And you can also have a hypothetical statement with implicit references to context, mechanism, and or outcomes. So in this example, you've taken off the if-then. So if-then I sometimes describe as the training wheels. If you're new to the approach, I would recommend using if-then. But at some point, you might start to find that the if-then statement, the if-then structure gets a bit restrictive. So you can actually remove that structure if you feel confident, and you can create statements that are like hypothetical statements that have implicit CMO configuration. So for example, here, it's the same example, vulnerable communities who are given mobile phones with specialized weather applications and push communication climate-related advice will be informed and respond more quickly to climate shocks, leading to reduced mortality, injury, and property loss or damage. So same program theory statement, just not using the if-then. And there is some implicit reference to context, mechanism, and outcome. So just as an exercise, we won't do it here, but once people are listening to this as a recording, you can pause this recording and try to see if you can pull out the context, the mechanism, and the outcome from the statement, and then click resume, because now I have a hypothetical CMO configuration on the same program theory. So your program theory can also look like a hypothetical CMO configuration. And one thing that I also may recommend is that you might start with if-then statements, and then part of developing your candidate program theories is move those if-then statements into hypothetical CMO configurations that then can be more, so the CMO configurations are just more fleshed out, and you can use that to develop your data collection protocol. So then here you have context, mechanism, and outcome. So context could be that resource-poor communities are more vulnerable to climate-related shocks due to a deficiency of material resources which would buffer against severe weather events. So I mean, a lot of this is common sense, really. If you think about people who are in resource poor experiences, they may be living in homes that don't have solid construction. They may not own transportation vehicles that can get them out of an emergency situation. So all those material lacks increase vulnerability, real vulnerability to mortality, injury, property loss, etc. So then the intervention, as has been said in the previous statements, is that mobile phones, weather application, and push communication related advice, and then we have that as the resource, will motivate people in vulnerability to act through information and advice, so there's the response, and through a triggered feeling that climate preparedness is something being taken seriously by the wider community. So, and that's another response. Now I've added a few extra, this is hypothetical. We're not saying that this is exactly what happens, but it's like we could imagine this possibly could be the case. And there are more than one response here. So the question about whether you would separate that out into separate mechanisms or not, that's a good question, and that's something that you need to grapple with, whether your mechanism has multiple responses, multiple resources, or if the mechanism has single resources and responses. But there's no hard and fast rule about that. Sort of, you have to decide if you're going to cluster it or not. But still, we're separating out the resource and the response, and that's the main thing. And then you have the outcome: reduced mortality, injury, property loss, damage. So I wanted to give you something very specific and very tangible, in hopes that this will help as we get more into this discussion about timelines. And then at the end of the presentation, if you have questions related to this, I'll be happy to clarify. So now I want to talk about conceptualizing outcomes. So we've just, briefly talked about the idea of establishing candidate program theories. But here what I'm saying is that conceptualizing outcomes may be a precursor to establishing candidate program theories. In other words, that you may start with this real enthusiasm to sketch out your candidate program theories, but as you do that, what you may find is that the outcomes are actually quite complex and lofty. A lot of outcomes for funded projects. So the project gets funding because there is a very lofty goal at the end that sounds very good. But how you get there is another question. And so to really understand how you get to, say a lofty outcome, like for example, resiliency, which is a real sort of buzzword now in a lot of sectors, talking about how do you increase resiliency capacity. You may need to conceptualize the outcomes, in other words, how you get there, through a series of stages or a time-sensitive analysis, etc. So conceptualizing outcomes, not just trying to capture the outcomes, but actually conceptualizing the outcomes, may become part of the initial process of realist program theorizing. So projects typically have outcomes of interest. So for example, improve resiliency against climate-related shocks and stresses. So that's sort of carrying on from our previous example. However, a fair evaluation of such outcomes may require a conceptualization of how they accrue over time, or in stages, or in a relay with intermediate outcomes. So I think this becomes very, very important, because if you haven't done this conceptualizing work and you just go straight to some kind of scale or inventory that tries to measure, resiliency, because there are these inventories now that purport to measure the level of resiliency. But if it's not properly theorized and outcomes properly conceptualized, you may actually be doing more harm than good in your evaluation, and actually creating skewed and misleading results. So that's a bold statement that I'm making there, but I hope that I will be able to unpack this to convince you of that argument if you've not already been convinced. You probably are convinced of the argument, that's why you're here. But I hope to try to spell that out, and if I don't, ask me a question at the end about it. And so this is where questions of dosage and timeline of impact may play an important role. Okay, so an article that I have been inspired by is Michael Woolcock's article, Toward a Plurality of Methods in Project Evaluation, a Contextualized Approach to Understanding Impact Trajectories and Efficacy. I really like this article. It's very clear, very lucid, and it may even spell out some of the arguments I'm making today, even in a much more articulate way. So I really encourage you to read that article. What I'm doing is putting a realist slant on this whole issue of timelines of impact. Woolcock is not working in the realist evaluation paradigm, but basically we're sort of saying the same thing, and I really appreciate his message. So the question about how do outcomes accrue? So it's about how do you conceptualize outcomes? Well, one issue is that you may have an evaluation time frame where you collect baseline data, and then you might have a midterm evaluation, then you have final evaluation. And this represents the sort of time span for the actual evaluation. And as you can see already, what I'm about to say here is that what happens when the outcome of interest suddenly gains traction, gains momentum after the evaluation is completed. And the danger here is that the final evaluation may show minor improvements in the outcome of interest. So if you do the final evaluation at this time point, and say you did a randomized controlled trial, you did a counterfactual study, and you took great effort to reduce contamination, eliminate contamination and bias, and all those things that need to be put into place for a randomized trial to have high quality, to produce high quality evidence for its paradigm. So then you end up with something that shows, okay, well, the intervention had maybe moderate effects, maybe low to moderate effects. That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. But then the question is, what happens after? And what if this happens here? And so how do we ensure that we're not creating more harm in our evaluation than good by the under-theorizing of how outcomes accrue? Okay, so that's one general point, is that we have to be very careful about understanding our timelines, and not only timelines, but understanding the patchwork of effects and context interactions over time that can produce outcomes of interest. So this would be really good news, better late than never, you could say, or you could say that, through this lesson, you could in the next iteration of evaluation, try to create a longer longitudinal design for your evaluation. So then you might have another story, or it could be the same story, but I'm just pulling out another facet of it, which is you have this baseline midterm final evaluation. And again, the story is that the final evaluation shows minor improvements in the outcome of interest down here. But if you try to imagine the question about how do you build resiliency capacity for climate change adaptation and resiliency, what you may theorize is that during the program, during the implementation of the program, you are causing effects. You are creating responses. People are responding positively to the program. They are gaining an awareness of the need for climate change. But the outcome of interest, which is resiliency, doesn't manifest until there is a climate-related event, which may happen years down the line. And so it's this challenging question about how do you capture resiliency outcomes, because you actually need to sort of wait and see how things play out. Now, and then there's the whole question of what's also happened between the end of the program and the start of a climate-related event. So are there supportive factors in the context that are maintaining the sort of the mechanisms of the program, or are there disabling elements of the context that are sort of disintegrating the efforts or disintegrating the mechanism? So what I'm saying is that what's interesting is that when we talk about the idea of mechanisms triggered to produce outcomes, you may have mechanisms that are being triggered here. So in other words, during this time frame, you may have mechanisms triggered. So people feeling like this is important, they're recognizing the need for efforts to be done, they're recognizing the need for preparedness. So those are all mechanisms that are working, but they are below the surface. They may not be so apparent. And even to the participants themselves, participants of a program may not be fully aware of how ready they are becoming until a climate change event happens when sort of it gets put to the test. And once it gets put to the test, then we know how successful those resiliency efforts were. So that's a general challenge of many types of evaluations and the nature of programs and the outcomes of interest that they're trying to measure. So this is sort of continuing on that discussion. So the question is there a time delay between the activation of mechanism and evidence to support outcomes of interest? And so it's this basically it's a very similar thing I'm saying on this slide as I was as in the other one, is to say that there is this evaluation time frame, and during that time, mechanisms are being activated. So there has been training, there is the introduction of technology, there's learning around that technology, there's gaining a sense of importance around the issue. But here, this red square is like a radical change in the context that then either further triggers the mechanisms to activate or reactivates those mechanisms, but in a sort of with the volume turned up. So maybe during this time here, that's sort of a practice run, or people sort of mentally preparing, thinking about it. And here the mechanisms sort of get ramped up. And another good article to read in relation to this discussion is Dalkin and al.'s article, What's in a Mechanism? Developing a Key Concept in Realist Evaluation. And this is good for a discussion about triggering and the dimmer switch metaphor. So Dalkin uses this idea of a dimmer switch for the idea of a mechanism. So it's not just an on-off switch, but that it can increase gradually over time. So that may be useful here for theorizing your program. Okay. So to sum up about timelines, it could be said that the nature of some programs is such that outcomes of interest manifest over long time periods through a chain of intermediate outcomes, or when there is a radical shift in the context. So, but in that example, a radical shift could be a weather-related event. There could be other types of radical shifts, but even in the absence of a radical shift in the context, there could be just a long time delay between the activation of mechanisms and outcomes of interest. And that can also relate to how entrenched problems are in the context. So in context A, you could have very deeply entrenched problems that go back centuries. So that would presumably take a lot more time to change. And in context B, maybe those problems are sort of not so deeply rooted, that they're more recent, or that there's already been a lot of work done to uproot those problems, so that when this new program comes in, there is less of a time delay. So you can see that context, the analysis of context, can also play into an analysis of timeline of impact, depending on the nature of the context. Okay, and in these circumstances, outcomes of interest need to be theorized along an extensive causal chain, even if beyond the time frames of empirical testing. I think this is a very, very important point that I'm making here, is that when you do and this is the take-home message of this webinar. If you take home this one point here, then I think that I will feel satisfied, is that when you do your program theorizing, so when you're constructing your candidate program theories, I don't advise you to limit your theorizing to that which you can empirically test. I advise you to brainstorm the full extent of your vision of how this program is playing out in the long term. So write down everything about the program, all aspects of the program, about the context and about the longevity and the need for time sensitivity, etc. And then you may have limitations in your evaluation time frame, limitations in your evaluation budget to accomplish the testing of those theories, and be very transparent about what it is you have tested in your theorizing and what you are leaving for future testing due to time constraints and human resource constraints. That is, I think, very justifiable and also very wise, because I think that in the absence of doing that, our sort of the evolution of our evaluation science is really stunted. We are really quite delayed in the where we should be in terms of our understanding of evaluation science. And I think this is what Ray Pawson is also saying in his work as well, is that in the quest for, you know, high quality, robust, empirical, scientific evidence, we sometimes miss this more realistic view of how things are working. And in missing that precludes us from figuring out how to develop our methodology to then be able to test it. So if in your current study, you are not able to test the full range of possibility of how something is working, at least you've put it down and you've published that, and you've made it very transparent what you're tested and what you haven't. And maybe that will open up the possibility for developing testing protocol in the future around how you envision this to work. And in some cases, conceptualizing outcomes is required in advance of capturing evidence on outcomes of interest. So like I said, you have outcomes of interest. Sometimes they're very lofty. So well-being, for example, or improved capacity around many dimensions. Those are very lofty goals. So how do you get there? You might need to conceptualize your evidence. So that's about timelines. Now I want to talk about dosage. So the Merriam-Webster dictionary says that the definition of dosage is that it's the measured quantity of a therapeutic agent taken at one time. So, you know, dosage we often think of as, you know, affiliated with the taking of pharmaceutical medication, for example, or it's in the medical context that dose has really been used most. But I'm sort of expanding that definition of dosage to include basically the repetition of efforts over time. So here they talk about therapeutic agent. So, you know, maybe it's a therapeutic agent, but or maybe it's not, but in any intervention, you have intervention resources. So the question about how many times do you need to put that resource into place before change starts to happen, so mechanisms start to get triggered. So for some interventions, the question of dose is simply a question of how many times an intervention needs to be delivered before the mechanism is triggered. Okay, so that's a very simple sort of question. If you have a workshop where you're training, where you're delivering a training, do you need to do that once, or do you need to do that 3 times, 6 times, 12 times? Is there a question of how many times you do it that makes a difference? And surprisingly, this is something that gets missed in realist program theorizing. And in a sense, it's a bit it's a real oversight, because if you were to go to the doctor and say, I have a problem, and the doctor prescribes you medication, they wouldn't prescribe you one pill. They wouldn't say, you know, well, maybe there are certain specific examples where it's just one pill, but usually you take a series of pills, a number of the same pill over a certain duration for the effect to occur. So why wouldn't that also be the case for socially contingent interventions? And so that's basically what I'm saying here. And so in addition, the repeated insertion of resources and efforts over time may be needed to make the context more fertile in order for the intervention to take hold. So, you know, creating a counterculture space, for example, may be needed before an intervention is really uptaken. So initially you might say we need to create climate adaptability. But in order to do that, you need to raise awareness of the issue. You might need to correct gender equity imbalances. You might need to correct poverty imbalances. And so what kinds of resources that need to be inserted repeatedly over time, and you might need to build trust. And that's a very big one. So coming into a community, for example, where there is historic levels of mistrust of outsiders and researchers and government for justifiable reasons, for historic abuses and transgressions against the community. There might be a repeated effort of trust building over time that doesn't take hold initially. Maybe it takes many efforts before the community starts to react with a feeling of, okay, I think I finally do trust these people who have come in here. But it may take time, and it may take a repetition. So dose is a bit, maybe a very coarse metaphor when you're talking about something like trust. So maybe dose as the actual terminology is not appropriate, but the underlying idea of dose is really what I'm trying to get at here. And so the question of dose and frequency may also be part of a longer causal chain analysis. So here's an example. So this is a different example now. Say you have a bicycling promotion intervention. So I've chosen these kind of very sort of relatively clear interventions just for our learning purposes here. So say city planners have created a new cycling infrastructure in the downtown grid to reduce car ridership, pollution, and to promote healthy lifestyle. So it's basically they've created bike lanes and new traffic signals to facilitate bike ridership in a downtown core. Then they found that 5 years after the completion of the new bicycling lanes, it was suggested that bicycling training workshops be given for free at community centers across the targeted municipalities, as car ridership had not declined. So they had high hopes for the program that this new bicycling grid on the downtown core would reduce car ridership. They found it didn't reduce, so they thought maybe what we need to do is train people who usually ride cars and who are hesitant to get on a bicycle, to get on a bike and just try it, because maybe once they try it, they will realize that this is actually enjoyable and has many benefits. And so the program would consist of a free of charge afternoon workshop, 90 minutes in a classroom learning about road rules and technique, and 90 minutes on the road with a trained coach. And that they put newspaper ads would be published targeting a 25 to 45 age demographic and marketed to people who have no experience riding a bicycle. So they put some effort into, this is a hypothetical situation, although informed by a recent conversation I had about a fascinating project very similar to this. And so they put some effort around it. They put in a newspaper ad to target a specific population. They really wanted to get people who had never ridden before out to community centers, get training, and get on bicycles to start riding. So that was basically the intervention. Now going back to our candidate program theories, let's just say that this could be a program theory component using if-then statements. So we could say that if people who are cycling illiterate, so they don't know anything about riding a bike, learn techniques of bike ridership and rules of the road, and have the opportunity to practice riding under the supervision of an expert mentor, then they will increase their confidence for riding a bicycle and will start riding on their own. Okay, so it's a very beautifully crafted if-then statement that sounds wonderful. If we can test this theory and confirm that this is correct, then we may have more, some more evidence to really scale up this cycling training programs to increase ridership. But what might happen is maybe before you do the interviews and the evaluation of the actual training program, you do a realist review of the similar kinds of programs across the country or maybe internationally. And say it was conducted on the program and it was found that some regions offer one standalone workshop, whereas other regions offer 3 sessions, others offer 6 sessions. And so the intrinsic logic of the workshop, where you have a didactic session in the classroom where you learn road rules and you have an expert mentor going on the road where they're helping you on the road, that has an intrinsic logic, and you can theorize the impact of those specific components. But then the question of dosage, does that become important? And I would obviously, as you probably expect, argue that it does become important. And again, I want to go back to Wilcox's article that I referred to before. And in that article, he talks about the J curve. And so you can see in this sort of chart diagram here, it's a very sort of stylized J, but there is a J in this diagram. And so up on the side here, it's the level of interest in ridership. And so interestingly, at the start, before attending any session, there might be some mid-range interest in riding. So people are sort of still kind of interested in riding. And then in session 1, they got the training, they went on a bicycling experience for the first time, and they went on the roads, and say one of the participants in their interview said, the first time on the road I was scary, I almost got hit, I'm not sure about this. And their confidence goes down. It goes down below what it was before they ever had any training at all. And it sort of goes along with this kind of general pattern that may be the case for interventions, that things get worse before they get better. And we can think of our own personal lives, examples in our personal lives, to know that there is some common sense wisdom about this, about that saying that things can get worse before they get better. So then the question is, if you only had one session and it stopped there, then would you be doing more harm than good by just giving one experience that ends up being negative? And then the rider sort of leaves with that experience and never comes back. But in cases where there's 2 sessions, 3 sessions, so say, for example, this is a hypothetical situation, but say in the second session, they go again, their feeling is, I'm apprehensive, but there are 3 sessions, so I'll give it another try. So they try again, they ride on the road. It wasn't incredibly amazing, enjoyable experience, but they, felt that they accomplished it and they weren't traumatized at the end. And then maybe on the 3rd session, at the end, they've said, okay, I didn't fall or get hit after 3 sessions. I even liked the feeling of riding. But it was really on the 3rd session that the feeling of a pleasant feeling came. So we're talking about the mechanism as the response. So maybe that pleasant feeling or the realization of the benefits only came after the 3rd session. So, I mean, we can design programs with great attention to detail in terms of the content. So the content of the didactic classroom session of the training program, or the training of the expert mentor to ride and to coach them in riding the program, all of that may be thought through to its careful, and perfect end. But then dosage might make all the difference. And I think this may be the case for a lot of studies. So if you haven't theorized dose, if you haven't theorized the impact of repetition over time, you may be missing maybe even the most important aspect of your program in terms of how it works. Okay, so so then what I'm saying is that you can expand your candidate program theory components. So like I said, you have the if-then, the first if-then. If people who are cycling illiterate learn techniques of ridership on the road, they have the opportunity, etc., then they will increase their confidence. So that's what I said earlier. But then you can add more program theory components that reflect dosage. So another one could be, if only one session workshop is offered, then some people may lose rather than gain confidence, because being naive and inexperienced on the road is unexpectedly pleasant or fear-inducing. A pleasant feeling is not achieved in the first session, and the potential rider loses interest. So you can add that as part of your theory component. And then you can add another one to say, if the right number of sessions is offered, the potential rider is able to overcome initial fears and experiences enjoyment while riding, leading to sustain interest and increased ridership. So what's interesting too is that in your initial candidate program theories, you may not need to put a specific number. You may not need to say 6 is the right number. And then to add more to the story, that different people will need different amounts. So even though you may offer a standardized approach, say 3 sessions, it is the case that some people will be fine after 1 session. Some people may need more than 3 sessions. And so that, as well as you do your theorizing, the for whom question can also surface in relation to dosage. And so in your initial candidate program theorizing, when you say the right number of, you're leaving it open. And that can help you as you translate that into your data collection protocol. You can initiate a discussion with your interviewees about, well, what is the right number? What is the right number for you? How do you determine the right number? Etc. But if you haven't theorized this at the outset, you may not think to include this in your interview guide, and then at the end of your study, you look back and you regret not realizing that dosage might be an important factor. It might not be an important factor for every study, but certainly I think for a lot of studies, it may be an important factor. So yeah, we're approaching time here, but I've just got a few more slides. I think we're doing fine. And then as questions, start thinking about your questions now, and you can fill them in the question box, and we'll have a nice, good probably 30 minutes for questions. The other thing I want to talk about, just to mention, is that dosage may also be needed for improving the context. So if I use the metaphor of a garden, as I've used before, you might have an intervention that has lofty goals, but if you use so say you want to grow sunflowers. Sunflowers are huge, very tall, beautiful, grand plants with beautiful big flowers at the end. But you might find that the soil is very dry, very rocky, very infertile. And that what you need to do before just throwing seeds onto the soil is you need to till the soil, aerate the soil, pull out the stones, pull out the weeds, water it, put compost. All those efforts initially need to be put in place to fertilize, to create a more fertile context for the intervention to take hold. So that metaphor of the garden, I think, to me, fits well with very complex programs like, for example, resiliency programs for climate adaptation. And some of this work has been inspired by the BRACE program. So BRACE is Building Resilience and Adaptation for Climate Extremes and Disasters. I have put a link there to the website. So I'm not talking about the program, but I have been inspired by some of the really sort of interesting, innovative work that's being done on the ground to tackle very complex issues. So the concept of dose may be important for improving the context in order for the intervention to take hold. So, for example, hosting a series of gender equity workshops for improving community food security programs, because one may theorize, and it has been theorized and has been argued from the ground up as well, that gender equity is required for food security to really sort of be successful in certain contexts, certain populations. And so you might say have a series of community-led workshops to raise awareness of gender equity needs. And you wouldn't just run one workshop, because one workshop alone is just not enough, considering the historical context of patriarchal culture in communities, and we're talking, worldwide, in most societies actually in the world. So even if it's a very small effort, so a workshop, a community-led workshop where you're making the link between climate adaptability and gender equity, and you're involving the community, and you're overcoming barriers, you're creating new understanding. But the key is, how many workshops do you need? Because clearly one workshop is not going to be enough, but the magic number is also unknown. So, and you have a certain funding time frame, and you have to decide how many workshops. So this may also be part of your program theorizing, not just to say for individual mechanisms to get triggered, you need a dose effect, but you also need a dose effect to transform the cultural context. And this is happening in many different settings in healthcare as well. I worked with a team that's trying to change the culture of the institutional culture to make it more compassionate towards patients and staff. So it's creating a counterculture or a third space or a new context of cultural understanding. So dosage and repetition can be very, very important in that. So to sum up, so I'm just going to sum up now. This is, I think, my last slide. So questions about dosage and timelines of impact should be considered during realist program theorizing. And transparency is key. So if you have, say, your program theory statements, like I have sort of outlined in this presentation, you might, like I said, brainstorm your theory statements that are beyond what you're able to test. So just be very clear, make it very explicit which theories are being tested in your current study. And you're perfectly justified to hold those other theories in place. It doesn't make sense to reject them because you haven't tested them. In fact, those theories, so for example, theories F and G might actually be even more important than the theories you've tested, but you just didn't get to them, you weren't able to get to them, or they emerged late in the stage of your research process, or it just required more resources than were available, or the time delay is too far. So if you're talking, some projects take 10 years, 20 years, a whole generation is required before real change happens. And so you just need to hold those theories and mark them as untested, or maybe you find a different way to test them through a different evidence base. There's so many possibilities, but this is a realistic way of approaching your evaluation design and fits very well with realist evaluation. So I've spoken now for 60 minutes, and I know that that's been very dense. I hope that was lucid and clear, but if not, now's your opportunity to ask questions. Here is my email address. You're more than welcome to email me. There's my website address. And one last thing I'll just mention is that if anything in this presentation is suitable for your work and you want to reference it, by all means, I think that you can reference it, and you can look up, depending on your style, your bibliographic style, look up how to reference webinars, and then just include content from here with a reference to it in your work, and hopefully that will support the work that you're doing. So that's all I have, Peter, for the formal part of the presentation, and I'm ready for questions now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Justin. I thought that was really interesting. We have had a bunch of questions come through. If anyone else has got a question, please do. I think we've got time for more if more come through, so feel free to type away. The first, I've got a couple of questions here which I think are fairly related. If not totally related. The question is, can you talk about using case studies as data collection? And then a kind of follow-up question, does the realist framework work with case studies or case study?
Yes. So absolutely, the realist framework does work with case studies. And you might want to read Martin Hammersley's work on case study, because that was recommended by Ray Pawson as well as a very good resource for understanding case study and potentially how that can fit with the realist evaluation. But my opinion is that case study works very well because when you look at individual cases, you're looking at the playing out of interventions in a bound context. And so you can do a very nice sort of CMO configuration around these bounded contexts to understand how something is playing out, how something is working across differences in context. Now, how you define context is a good question, and there are different ways of defining context. Some people talk about macro context and micro context. Some people talk about outer context and inner context. Sometimes context is about the really sort of the big things like rural versus urban, and sometimes context is more about, say, demographic, like 25 years old versus 45 years old. So some elements of context cut across cases all the time. So age, for example, might cut across all cases. But then there are elements of context that are very specific to individual cases. And so the case study approach can really be useful for developing an analysis around these bounded contexts when contexts are different from site A to site B. And so can you talk about using case study as data collection? I mean, essentially, you can take a number of cases and develop your program theories, to gain an understanding about what it is about the differences or even the similarities amongst these different cases. Develop your program theories related to those cases, and then do data collection within those sites to try to understand how that specific context is interacting with the mechanisms within that site. So that's how, I mean, in a general sort of way, you would do data collection, that you could develop data collection protocols that are specific to each of your sites in your case study analysis to really get at the interaction between context and mechanism. So, you know, I hope that's helpful, and if not, you can ask another question. Okay, Peter, what is the next?
We got the next question here. I think you did start to touch on this after it's asked, but I think maybe it's worth going over it. Is it helpful to include as much detail as possible in candidate program theories, or does adding detail to candidate program theories make evaluation highly complex?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I'm assuming what you're asking, the second part, is not that the candidate program theories not only make it highly complex, but make it complex beyond what is productive. Because there's nothing wrong with something being highly complex if, you know, it's comprehensible and it's productive to think so, to really go there, to take that plunge into the complexity. But the question is there a point of diminishing returns where you are developing your program theories to such an extent that you sort of get lost in it, and you sort of, you know, you're sort of taking the dive into the ontological depths, but you've gone so deep that now you're just sort of overwhelmed. And that is a real struggle that people do have, because people who, you know, most people I find that start off doing a realist evaluation, they realize that they're actually quite good at theorizing. They've got very sensitive minds to think, and it's actually hard to shut off your minds. And so one thought leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, and you start to go very sort of broad and very deep into the complexity frame. And yes, it's a concern. And so where you need to rein it in is you need to then think about, what is the product of my research going to be, and where can it be useful? How can it be useful? So there may be some aspects of your program theorizing that, yes, they may be true and they may be tested, but will this really help in the innovation of the program, in the determination of how to allocate resources? And if you keep that pragmatic focus, and this is what Ray Pawson has said as well, Pawson and Tilley, if you keep that pragmatic focus while still not closing yourself off to the possibilities, then that will save you in the end from getting sort of overwhelmed with the complexity. So yes, it is helpful to include as much detail as possible, but not to the point where sort of the elements are kind of irrelevant to program innovation, is how I would answer that question. And maybe that will serve to guide your theorizing.
Is that a decision, Justin, you think something that is kind of a skill you learn through experience of when to start to cut off the additional, when that point of sort of diminishing returns or no more returns, when you hit that
I think so. I think so. It's definitely comes with skill, but I think people would be surprised to realize that when you apply that pragmatic frame, there are certain elements of your program theorizing that you can cut off right away, because you realize right off the bat that, okay, it's because one thing that people do when they talk about the for whom question is you can start to get into personality differences. So say, for example, in a bike riding program, you might develop theories of, for this type of person, it would work well for this, for that type of person, it would work. And maybe that's useful, but maybe you might also realize that your commissioner is not going to innovate the program to the extent of customizing the program to very specific personality types. And that's not to say that that's not important, and from a general sense of causation, but from a pragmatic focus, it might be just some way to help in making the frame of the evaluation and the theorizing manageable, or shelving those details for future study down the line. But yes, I think it comes with expertise as well.
Okay. We had a quick question on slides. I can confirm the slides will be made available and the video of the session afterwards. The next sort of substantive question we had was about application. Does this approach to program theorizing also work for realist synthesis as well as evaluation, i.e. for evaluations of interventions, e.g. across different countries rather than just one evaluation on one intervention? Would this assumption be correct? Does it matter?
Right. Now, that's a great question as well. Now, one of the differences between evaluation and synthesis typically is the degree of heterogeneity of what it is you're studying. Because when you do an evaluation, so first of all, you might do an evaluation of one project in one site. So it's one case, for example. Even if you do an evaluation of the same project in multiple sites, you have the same project with some different context, maybe implementation has some differences. So there's some heterogeneity, there's some differences. When you do a realist synthesis, quite often what you find, especially when you go international, is that unless you're working in an area where you have an intervention that has been implemented with fidelity, so it's a standardized intervention that is implemented exactly the same way in different sites, which can be the case, but more often is the case is that the realist synthesis is going to capture a much more heterogeneous set of interventions that are working towards similar goals. So if you did a realist review on resiliency-based interventions for climate adaptation, if you just went to the literature and you looked at that, you would find that in terms of the architecture of programs that have been implemented on the ground, there could be a diversity of ways in which the programs are being developed in different contexts. So this heterogeneity is going to alter the nature of your program theorizing. And this is where this is why Pawson emphasizes middle range theory in his realist synthesis book. So in the realist evaluation book, the emphasis, well, they still talked about middle range theory, but there was more discussion of program theories in the realist evaluation book. In the realist synthesis book, because there is an assumed sort of higher level of abstraction, because of the heterogeneity across interventions, that you may need to have theories that are more generic or more, not necessarily generic, but just have they're somewhat one step removed from the actual program details of the program on the ground. So in the presentation I did today, the program theories are very much related to specific resources that were implemented in context. My advice in a synthesis is to try to get to that level if you can, to look at articles that have published interventions to see what exactly was done, what specific resources were implemented in context. But quite often the detail isn't there because people don't write their published articles with the idea somebody's going to come along and do a realist synthesis on that article. So those details aren't there. So the nature of the theorizing changes. So it's not that it's not useful, but it does change and it does become more at the middle range. So that's a big discussion, but it's really an excellent question. I hope I've answered it.
Brilliant. The next one we have with a little thank you. Hi, Justin. Thank you for the interesting webinar. The question is, how do you think dosage is related to ripple effects, which you describe in your projects about participatory research? Are these two related or two different subjects?
That's a great question. And yes, I have written about the idea of ripple effects in the work that I did on community-based participatory research, which has also been greatly informative for today's presentation, although I didn't refer to it specifically because I've talked about it a lot in other presentations, and there's only so much that I can talk about one project. But if you look at our 2015 paper, and if you need a reference for that, you can go to my website under the About section, and there's references of publications, my recent publications. There's a 2015 paper on community-based participatory research and the ripple effect, where we take this idea of context, mechanism, outcome, and we link it in a chain so that the idea is that outcome can become context over time. So early on in academic community partnerships, there was a need to establish trust. So trust efforts, so the mechanism was the trust, and then the outcome was sustained trust initially, which became a context in a subsequent phase of the research. So that was the idea of a ripple effect, and you may find that the ripple effect, in terms of conceptualizing your outcomes, as I've said today, may become very, very useful. Now the question here is, what is the relationship between dosage and ripple effect? So it's slightly different, although they may be the same thing, but the difference, where they could be different, is that what I'm saying about ripple effect is that you might have a series of intermediate outcomes that are linked. So an intermediate outcome that becomes a context that then leads to new outcomes that become context that leads to new outcomes. That's not the same thing as a repetition of a resource. It may be. I'm not saying it's not, but it's slightly different. So dosage could simply mean also the repetition of the same intervention resource over time. So in the bicycling example, it's like 1 session versus 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. And so I think dosage has an added component. The ripple effect and the dosage, they have an overlapping definition, but then they also have some difference. And so for some people, the ripple effect might not be that useful, but dosage might be very useful because of the idea of repeating the same intervention over time. But in our example with the ripple effect using trust, there was a dosage effect. There was a repeated effort at trust amongst the community collaborators and the academics. So the academic staff, the academic collaborators, showing cultural humility, demonstrating that they're there for the community, that they're not going to abandon the community, that they're not in it just for their personal gain or their professional academic careers. Those were like repeated attempts over and over to establish trust, and then eventually trust was established. In certain cases, different scenarios played out differently. But so you could see how dosage even worked in that sense of like the effort, the repeated effort of establishing trust. So it's a very good question, and this basically all of this is designed for me just to that the purpose of this is a conversation starter. So I'm hoping that you go back into your research teams and you listen to this, and this will just sort of open up a conversation.
Great
okay,
stuff.
Peter, the next question.
Yeah, we've got a question here, quite a long one, so I apologise if when I read it out things get a bit lost, but I'll do my best. So the question is, I'm a PhD student and thinking about using realist evaluation for the early stages of fieldwork in water sanitation and hygiene, an intervention in water sanitation and hygiene in low and middle income contexts. I think the most need right now is to conduct an in-depth baseline assessment to know what is going on and wash out various societal levels, e.g. individual, community, institutions, both in terms of behaviours, natural environment and infrastructure. Ideally, I would love to get to implementing interventions, but don't think within the PhD timeline that I will. Do you have any advice on incorporating realist evaluation for just the early stages in an applied project that can help drive the project beyond the PhD? And do you have any recommendations on example work that I can look at where people demonstrate realist evaluation applied in the early project stages?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And so I think what I would say is that absolutely you can develop your PhD sort of from this perspective of the baseline with the idea that by the end of your PhD, you're not implementing an intervention, but you have the opportunity here to develop an intervention. Which then can be tested in, say, your postdoc, for example. And this is what people are doing. I'm having lots of conversations with people who are interested in using realist evaluation to develop programs. And now there isn't a lot of articles out there on development. If you go to the 2016 special edition of Evaluations, that's the July 2016 edition of the Evaluation Journal, so the Journal of Evaluation. Myself, along with Nick Tilley and Elliot Stern, we co-edited the volume, and all articles there are on realist evaluation. And there is one article there on realist developmental evaluation. But I have to say that generally the field is still very new in this area. So there's not a whole lot of examples of work that's done for the purposes of developing sort of a protocol for new intervention. And one thing you could do is write to the Ramses Forum if you're not on that forum already, and basically ask there, because then people on that forum, there's very experienced practitioners work in that forum. It's a very supportive environment. It's about 800 people on that forum now. If you're not on the forum, send me an email and I'll give you instructions. It's an email discussion group for realist methodology. And people often will provide articles and ideas around this. But generally, my general response to your question is, yes, you can do that. And by studying the context, what you may do is, when you think of mechanism, what you're trying to do is imagine the kinds of resources and the kinds of responses that can be produced through new intervention components, given what's currently happening. So it's this sort of an imaginative process. You're not evaluating something that's already happened. You're imagining the mechanisms, and I think that can be very, very rewarding and very important. And then it would be great to have your contribution to this emerging field. So yes, well done.
Brilliant, thank you, Justin. There aren't any more questions from our attendees. I had one question, at least maybe two, that I wanted to ask, take advantage of my role as chair to ask. So it's one of the things we've been sort of starting to think about in CCAN is kind of the implications of the work we're doing for commissioning and actual design of evaluations, rather than just thinking about the methods and the tools we use. I was wondering, the thing that sparked a question for me about this was that obviously you showed us the slides where we see the outcomes might come quite far after the end of an evaluation has been happening, or even the policy or the program itself has finished. Are there any innovative ways, or have you seen any examples of commissioning or design of evaluations trying to deal with that issue of timelines and the lag in an outcome? Is it just a case of, well, we have to revisit things 10 years later, even if we're not interested in them, just in case we find there was a lag? Or, I mean, how do we deal with that issue in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue, because the other issue is, you might have an intervention that lasts 3 years, but then, outcomes of interest may happen 10 years down the line. And there's also the other confounding factor, which is all the time between the end of the intervention and the start of, the outcomes of interest. how do we know that the intervention can be attributed, the outcome can be attributed back to the resources of an intervention that happened 10 years prior, or through the events that have happened subsequent to that? Or is there sort of an intermingling of all of that? I mean, if you take this example of like another metaphor, say you have a glass of water and you put a drop of ink in the water, and that ink disperses and diffuses into that water and becomes basically over time, it becomes totally integrated into the water. Um, is that what happens with interventions as well? So you have an intervention that's worked on gender equity and worked on improving capacity and all these very amorphous, very untangible kinds of things that actually do have results in the end. So they actually do, but how do you test? How do we tease apart and really know that has happened? And so it's a real question, it's a real challenge, and this is a realistic view. So it's maybe some people will feel sad to realize that things are actually more difficult to measure than we would hope. So I know I'm not exactly answering your question. I've sort of taken it as a launch pad to a launching point to to give a little speech here, but it's I haven't come across a perfect solution to this situation. That's why I think that theorizing is the first step, and this is where we're still lagging behind. We don't often theorize the full extent of, in line with how things are really working. Where our theorizing is very sort of stunted and delayed, and so at least that's the first step. But how you get around it, even longitudinal impact assessment needs to be theorized properly, because you may then, put in the effort and go back after 10 years to see how things are done. But then data collection needs to be very carefully crafted so that you're still trying to tease out cause from intervention resources that were placed years prior. So maybe one thing that can be done is during the implementation to let people know that to build their reflective capacity. So people on the ground working, practitioners, frontline workers, and recipients of programs to build their reflective capacity so that they can continue over, even after the end of the final evaluation, their own monitoring and evaluation. Even at a ad hoc level, it could be informal, it can be just informal observation, but that they've increased their reflective capacity through sort of a realist thinking lens where you're trying to understand causation from a context mechanism interaction, so that you come back 10 years later and they will have something to say about how things have played out and how that can be, the extent to which that can be traced back to resources. Because like I said, the relay effect might be, when you think of a relay race where you have a baton and you pass it to the next and then that person passes it to the next, that can be how you conceptualize outcomes, where you have some outcomes, but then those outcomes lead into new outcomes over time. And if people can develop their capacity, but this is a long-term project, a long-term commitment to develop capacity for this kind of thinking in order to do longitudinal data collection where people can reflect back and make attributions of causation to resources and context. But I don't know, what do you, is that?
I totally agree. I like that you highlighted this sort of extra double problem as well as the one I articulated. But I think the idea of giving, as you say, the people implementing these things the tools to keep going, and so it's almost like the evaluation itself ripples on, or the effects of that carry on. I really like that, and that kind of capacity stuff I think is important and is part of that solution, even if there isn't a perfect solution. All of this for me as well links to my other question I had knocking around my head as you were talking, which is more sort of theoretical, abstract question about causality. And so obviously, so CCAN, it's in the title, complexity, where we're meant to be using complexity science, complex adaptive systems theory, and that kind of literature would tell us that getting at causality is not only difficult but probably impossible, and understanding individual causes or individual mechanisms is impossible. And then, if I'm understanding correctly, in a realist approach, when you used your metaphor of the the iceberg, you're saying the mechanism, and I then sort of go into a synonym of the causality is difficult or hard to get to, or it, are they saying the same thing, or do you think it's not that it's impossible, it's just very difficult to get at those mechanisms or that causality when we take a realist approach?
Yeah, if I understand your question, you're wondering if the way you're seeing it through like CCAN's perspective and the realist perspective on causality is the same thing?
Yeah,
Is that what you were asking?
is there a gap there, or are they actually quite close together? I think it is my question.
Yeah, I think it is quite close together, and so it's the common link there is the recognition that these are hard to get at. These are difficult. This is hidden or latent mechanisms are hard to unearth. But I guess the realist take there's a specific sort of promotion of this idea of ontology and ontological depth, where there are layers of reality. So instead of thinking of somebody's feelings as their subjective beliefs, we're bringing that into this element of reality, that feelings are real and they have real effects, just like other things that we think of as real. And so that's a slight sort of added point, just to say that it's about an ontological framing. But other than that, I think that there is that common understanding of causality being something difficult or hidden in terms of measuring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I think as a fact we could go on for ages, but I think we've hit
Yeah,
we've
I
hit
think
time
so.
there technically, so we
Yes,
haven't had any
yes.
more questions from the attendees. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much to Justin for another really interesting, informative session. I hope you've enjoyed all of them. As I've said before, we will put them up on the CCAN website, the recording and the slides. I think Justin may share them as well. You have Justin's
Yes.
email. I think you're free to get in touch with him as you please. Of course, also you can get in touch with us at CCAN through the website, through Twitter, or we have an email address, ccan@surrey.ac.uk. And yeah, just say thanks again to Justin. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and look forward to speaking or hearing from you soon. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks, Justin.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Peter.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.